Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by the wise and venerable Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm pretty well, thank you, pretty well. All things considered, with the first creeping tendrils of winter firmly planting themselves in my backyard. And of course, we also have the tall, hairy truth seeker, Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you?
Oh man, I took a sunrise walk, and it was like brisk. I like it.
Yes,
Sets up
brisk
a good
is
day.
exactly this weather. That is the perfect description for it. And of course, we are coming to you. I think we are all back in Joburg with the latest news and analysis about what's going on in SA. So this is a story that I must give full disclosure and say that I got from my dad, who is the DA's Shadow Minister of Mineral Resources. So there is a conflict of interest perhaps in us reporting on this, but I think it's still worth talking about because it's very much in the vein of the Piet Retief story that, of course, we covered very recently. And that is that a mining project near the northern Cape town of Prieska, which is really in the middle of nowhere. It's a really small town. I think it's got like 15,000 people in it. Is apparently, according to some reports from people on the ground there, facing armed intimidation and violence from a group demanding a share in the mine and control over contracts. This group allegedly showed up in the town. They mobilized some people in the community, and they demanded a cut of the mine's profits and contracts. This is similar to what has been described in other media as the construction mafia. It's a similar modus operandi. This is people who show up and demand their cut of any construction project. And I think that has been covered a bit, but this seems to be a new version of it because these guys are pretty heavily armed. Parts of the town were blockaded. All access to it was cut off by people placing burning tires and barricades. The protesters have been accompanied by a number of armed men who seem to be carrying a lot of guns and are really well armed. The protesters have also targeted the municipality, demanding it supports their demands for an additional share in the mine. The local ANC mayor has quite bravely stood up to them, even though they are armed and, by all accounts, not particularly peaceful. So I guess, there's also now been a couple of tense standoffs, which have almost ended in violence between private security, between local farmers, between the protesters. It's just a mess. Gabriel, what's your take on the story? Once again, it looks like the police aren't becoming involved here. Apparently, the police sent mediators, but then basically, there was very little action to actually control what seems to be close to an armed takeover of a town. What are your thoughts on this story?
Yeah, I think it's disconcerting, partly because when you see the pictures of smoke billowing into the heavens from tires burning on the ground and men with guns meeting on either side of the road, it just doesn't seem like it can possibly end well. So far, there's been a report on the ground, although we haven't managed to corroborate it yet, of a teenage youth being attacked by some of the protesters. It's a white youth, and that seems to be an important part of why he was attacked, although, like I said, we're going to keep drilling down into that. But and in that regard, I suppose it does remind one a little bit of Piet Retief, but the salient difference is no one's died here yet. So this remains, at some level, still like a good news story that could go very bad. It's worth bearing in mind also how unoriginal it is on two fronts. One being that South Africa has something like the record for the most violent protests per day. According to SAP's data, that was around 10 per day before the lockdown. And so people, just so many people aren't particularly surprised when this kind of thing happens. It's also unoriginal on the international scale for armed mafiosa to take over mining operations in this kind of way. This defined the politics of the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, Botswana to some extent. There were worries that this is the kind of thing that is happening for many years, where you have a breakdown in the rule of law, where police are not enforcing law and order, and people think that the only way to get ahead is to sort of cleave onto the nearest teat of the grand elephant of wealth. Then they will fight their way to get there. And so this is, I don't know, I feel like this is the kind of story that if a time traveler arrived here from Europe, from sort of medieval Europe, and say, hey, I know what's going on. That sounds like my life. How very welcoming. You guys have all these screens and lights and very strange cars that have no horses to pull them, and it's very alien. But here you have a mine with a mob trying to take over the mine and no real way to stop it. That feels just like home.
Lots of armed heavies standing off with each other. Yeah, no, it is very worrying, and it is a sort of, I guess you could call it the medievalization of parts of South African life, particularly in South Africa's rural areas, where because law and order has broken down, people really have to take over their own affairs. We're seeing, I mean, your friend Petrus, the farmer, and the water heroes, and Harry Smith having to take over the water production in their town. Law and order just generally breaking down, so people form sort of mobs to carry out justice. It's crazy stuff out there. So Terence, your thoughts on this case, and also the fact that part of the reason we don't know more details here is how badly the story has been covered in the media generally. Yesterday, Gabriel and I looked for stories on this. The Afrikaans media, I think OFM, had covered it a bit, and the Microsoft News service also covered it a bit. But for the most part, it's been described as a service delivery protest, which is, I think, not a helpful description in this case.
Yeah. Well, the thing that jumps up at me is the idea of construction mafia, and this is something that we see increasingly across the country. And apparently, it's the idea being that that a mob can show up and coerce legitimate business into cutting them into essentially paying them protection money. And this is something that has a long pedigree in history. You mentioned medievalism. We'll go to the Dark Ages, what they call the Danegeld, where you would pay the Vikings not to come and sack you. As Rudyard Kipling once notably wrote, "Once you've paid the Danegeld, you'll never get rid of the Dane." But this I know has become a major strategic problem in the construction industry, and I hear that it's now been reproduced elsewhere, like mobs demanding that that employees of firms be fired and they be taken on board. Apparently, there've been cases where the narrative has been strung that there's all this money was paid over to companies in COVID relief, and now everyone's entitled to go and get a job there, and they just have to show up. And if the boss doesn't want to give you a job, it's obviously because you've stolen the money. Desperate people, where there's a thin tendon of hope to hang on to, that may be all they have. I mean, I find it rather disconcerting that this seems to be accompanied by people with weapons that go somewhere beyond garden tools. It suggests that there's some organization and certainly some sort of some very sophisticated iron in the glove. And unless the trend in South Africa towards the breakdown of law and the undermining of its institutions is arrested, this is just going to become more and more common.
No, exactly. And of course, I sort of mentioned it briefly, but specifically the police are accused here of, firstly, allowing the demonstrators to sort of carry arms in public, failing to ensure freedom of movement for people around the town. They're alleged to have forced mine security to allow the demonstrators onto mine property. And also, the armed protesters have basically occupied some of the town's municipal offices. And the police, despite the objections of the mayor to this, right, who's completely not okay with this, have not really come to the party here. And that, once again, is worrying. And that I think is where the main connection between this and the Piet Retief story is, Gabriel, that it kind of seems like the police are either playing one side or at least playing this very badly. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it also reminds me of the first story that I covered for the Institute of Race Relations, which was in a sort of farm, 1,500 hectare farm called Ekhutuleni, about 100 kilometers east of Nkandla, in also one of the most rural parts of South Africa, where basically a community property association had been formed. There'd been a vote, and the leader elected was Mr. Mnyandu, William Mnyandu, and he was trying to get a title deed and trying to get a bit of sophisticated farming going. But the nearby chief, allegedly Thandazani Zulu, wanted to make a move on the land. Thandazani Zulu has been independently accused of assassination and intimidation, all in terms of trying to get land to expand mining. Not that he's much of a miner, but if he can get the land under his wing, then the mine can get in there and then he gets a cut out of it. These were the allegations. Now, what is clear to me is that an MP moved onto Ekhutuleni and forcibly removed Charles Nkumalo, the minister there, and Walter and William Mnyandu and their families. The police took them out of their homes, put them in the vans, and then they all watched as those homes were then set on fire. This was years ago. So I think that this doesn't happen more is largely due to the fact that South Africans avoid these kinds of conflicts, that if you see it coming, the threat of this is enough to just cut someone in before it's actually made material. So that's one kind of problem. I also, in the construction world, I came across a project in the East Rand of Joburg in the townships where someone was building an orphanage, and that for disabled children. And that project was halted repeatedly because of people coming in to attack workers and try and break down the place, because they said you should have hired us and not them, because they come from that side of the street and that's foreigners. We come from this side of the street. There was another protest at Hilton College, which had my favorite line. They shut down work at Hilton College, the most expensive South African private boarding school or whatever. And I said, why was that? Well, the staff said, oh, it was a terrible time. I said, what was the issue? And they said they were hiring foreigners. And I said, oh, from Lesotho. They said, no, from Pietermaritzburg. So, yeah, people do have these ideas of like who's the definition in the crowd.
Right, exactly. The definition of foreigner seems to be rather flexible sometimes.
But not all that confusing if you think about medieval period, or if you think about the mob in America during Prohibition. The in-group, out-group is about what family or set of families or clan do you show affiliation to, who is the godfather of everyone's children, who do you pay tribute to or protection money to, and then your side and their side. You can both be Irish Catholics, but if you're on the one side of the, or I suppose if you're in the Cape Flats, you can be a 69er or a 67er, and the dividing lines between you is much more than between most citizens and foreigners. So that is a pattern and practice that seems to be ramifying further. And the final point that I'd like to make about that is that in this case, and in so many of these cases that we've covered, I mean, Senekal was a very nice example because the crowds were so enormous descending from around the country. But we have seen this in multiple places. What has not yet happened is the standoff leading to a private Marikana, to a real gun battle between people trying to protect their stuff and a mob trying to get in on the action. Whether it's a construction company or a mine or a farm, whatever it is, it hasn't ended in big bloodshed in a way that it just will if this keeps going. And my opinion is that my prediction, our boss France likes to tell us to make predictions. My prediction is that when that day comes, these will seem like the good times, because one of those events will not be followed by a series of introspecting politicians reflecting upon how their rhetoric and poor practice might have led to this. But instead, will be used as further evidence that business owners and the like are a rapacious lot who must be taken out. And my prediction is that when one such event comes, if it does, it will be followed by several more. And so every effort should be made to stop that before it happens.
Definitely. Terence, any thoughts from you?
Just that I'm old enough to remember when the transition to democracy happened, there was a great deal of concern about crime. Now, I maintain a lot of this was because what you had was a sort of decline in political violence, particularly by about 1995. But South Africans were, to a large extent, not feeling very much safer because criminals were stepping into the breach, or you realize that your fear wasn't necessarily about about rival politicians shooting at each other, but there was something more sort of base and threatening in the fabric of society. And I remember that the government of the time, for years, there would be occasional nods to it, but the line was that this is not really a big problem. It's only white racists using crime as a stand-in word for black, for black people. I remember Charles Ngukula saying that you never find black people or township folk complaining about crime. All completely ridiculous. Around the same time that an opportunity to resurrect the police as a properly service-oriented professional crime fighting and citizen protection organization was thrown away on the altar of politicizing it. And now we harvest the bitter fruit.
Indeed, and instead of professionalizing the police force, we got Jackie Salebi, which
at least you can put together a sentence.
I think gangsterizing needs to be a verb. Gangsterizing the police force, gangsterizing the state. What about that?
That's good. Right. With that in the back of our minds, let us move overseas to a story that captured Terence's interest. And this is a story from Finland, that tiny, frozen, somewhat grey place in the far north. It's very nice, but a bit bleak, as I hear from people who have been there. And Finland's prosecutor general has announced that charges have been filed against a Finnish MP, Paavi Räsänen. Sorry, I'm not very good with Finnish names. In particular, Räsänen, yeah. I did practice this before the show, but anyway.
Those are all Nordics.
Yeah.
Yes. So she is being charged with incitement against homosexuals. This is following tweets she sent out in 2019 and for comments she made on a radio show, as well as a booklet she published in 2004. Now, the MP who has been charged is a long-serving member of Finland's parliament, and she belongs to the Christian Democrats, who are a conservative Christian party in Finland, and she's a former minister of the Interior. She's also a medical doctor and a devout Lutheran. Her tweets questioned the involvements of Finland's Lutheran Church in supporting an LGBTQI pride parade, and included an image of biblical text to support her position. She subsequently appeared on a talk show on Finnish state radio entitled "What Would Jesus Think About Homosexuals?" The booklet in question that she wrote in 2004 is called Male and Female. He created them, and was published by the Finnish Luther Foundation. Anyway, she's denied harboring hatred towards homosexual people, insisting that she's merely articulating an orthodox and Christian view of sexuality and marriage. Terence, you've thought about this topic. It looks like this is quite a concerning sort of attack on free speech here. Although, what's your take, man?
Well, it's one of these sort of one of these issues that on the face of it looks quite simple, no matter where you irrespective of which corner you're coming from. If your starting point is that you want to affirm the rights and dignity of homosexuals, then maybe you have some sympathy for the prosecutor. If your starting point is free speech, free religion, you tend towards Dr. Asanen. What strikes me though is this. This is the type of cultural war that is associated with the United States, where you have a very wide and diverse and often antagonistic set a political culture. The Nordic countries we often associate with very technocratic, sort of middle of the road, big consensuses about these things, and they're all squeakily polite to one another. In fact, I remember there was a little video that popped up my Facebook feed about how Helsinki has no homelessness because they've got this wonderful system where they actually assign every homeless person to a residence, and they have a social worker. It all seems great. Apparently, there's like 500 homeless people in Helsinki, so it was, it wasn't a huge hill to climb. But yes, and Finland is also a very secular society. Church going isn't a big thing, even though, as with even with countries like Sweden and Norway, the church history is very bound up with the culture and with the and with its history. And it does seem to be that from what I can see and from what I've been able to read, and admittedly, there's stuff in Finnish that I don't really have access to. She simply seemed to be expressing her particular view of this. She didn't seem to be advocating any sort of program of action or any sort of hatred. She was saying that within her particular frame of reference, which I imagine probably into the 1960s would have been fairly uncontroversial in Finland itself. This is just this is the position. What I also find very interesting is that she is being prosecuted for a book written in 2004, at a time when the Finnish state did not recognize same-sex marriages. It had a sort of civil partnership thing, but it did not allow same-sex couples to adopt. It did not recognize marriage in the same way. So in other words, she now faces prosecution for saying something at a time when that was not too far off official policy. How far back do we take this? To me, this also echoes the story of Ash's Bakery in Belfast, which got into the news because a Belfast baker refused to bake a cake for a homosexual client. The point, though, was not that he refused on that basis. The message was support gay marriage, and he said he's not going to do it because he doesn't, at a time when the position of the Northern Irish government was that they didn't have gay marriage in Northern Ireland. So he, in other words, was essentially endorsing the law as it stood. But he said he was not prepared to do this because it would imply that he is assisting someone to push a political message that he disagrees with. Are we as liberals okay with this or not? Now, let me just flip that around. Many of the people who I saw taking issue with Ash's Bakery, and I imagine would take issue with Dr. Asanen, would probably be very, very uncomfortable, for instance, with being forced to perform work, let's say, for the Brexit campaign or for Trump. Are we perhaps moving into a situation where there are certain unstated moral, cultural, political codes that one is, in a sense, required to endorse and support uncritically? The question of marriage is a big one. That is the foundation of one of the key institutions of society across the world. And believe me, same-sex marriage isn't the end of it. Why should polygamists or polyandrous, for instance, feel that they need to compromise? I think that the move to see marriage as an expression of love, to which I'm sympathetic, opened up a whole set of other doors. Previously, when marriage was seen as largely a relationship of social connection and a property rights, it was sort of easy to justify it in terms of saying, well, there are certain people who should be married to other people. When you start saying it's about love, then it becomes very difficult to make a coherent, logical argument. Say, well, why shouldn't two people of the same sex? Having come to that point, well, why shouldn't it be permissible for a group? We certainly see it in South Africa, in African culture. Why should we not move those practices into middle class suburbia? Tough issues. And do we punish people for opposing or for supporting?
So two things. Someone once suggested to me that because South Africa has both polygamous marriage and same-sex marriage legalized, that there theoretically exists a position where someone could marry 10 people, could all be married to each other of different genders, and then they said, now imagine this giant ball of marriage, and then imagine dividing an estate in that, and that there'll be a lot of work for the lawyers. But
well, there you go.
Gabriel, firstly, your thoughts on this, and secondly, one of the things that really is interesting to me about this case is how far sort of culture has moved on a lot of these issues.
Correct.
Go and watch something from 2013. Particularly like a comedian doing a routine or something, and look at how many jokes or things there would be considered sort of off color, or maybe get a social media campaign against you nowadays. It's been a pretty fast transformation. What are your thoughts, Gabriel?
Yeah, so I mean, I am pro gay marriage. I have been since the issue was on my mind as a kid. And yet at boarding school, I definitely went to a very homophobic boarding school. And I used to be called a fag and call people fags for, I don't know, liking the ballet or I don't know, stupid reasons that have nothing to do with sexuality. And
if you like ballet, I'm sorry.
But I outgrew that, and I'm glad that I did. And I do look back on some of the sort of attitudes that I expressed with some amount of shame. But I think that while also holding on to the thought that a lot of stuff can just be funny, and that there are good jokes to be made. So I think that the point that I always like to come back to on topics like this is violence. She's been charged. The police theoretically will go to her door, and if she resists arrest, she will be shot. And if she doesn't, she will be forcibly detained in a prison, or she will be forced to pay a fine, which means if you don't pay the fine again, force comes to bear. So I think that
the charge against her is that her statements are quote, likely to cause intolerance, contempt, and hatred towards homosexuals.
And that does strike me as an unfair reading. Now, I also can't read Finnish, but I have looked into this a little bit. And it seems that she upholds what I take to be the orthodox and correct Christian position, which is that human beings are all fallen angels. We all do wrong things, but that we are also all divine creatures, and so all worthy of a kind of ineffable respect. And that it's very important to judge the sin and not the sinner. And this is a line, I don't know, that I've heard from a lot of good Christians who feel uncomfortable about gay marriage, who resist gay marriage, but who, or just homosexual practice, but who also think that it's important not to diss or alienate or stigmatize people as a group, certainly not to throw them out not to throw the moral baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I think that there's great room for people whose views are different from mine and different from whomever's to make the case for or against gay marriage while upholding a kind of basic human respect, and while in fact insisting on that respect being paid to gays, while insisting on the fact that gays who promote gay marriage, or straights or whomever, should not go to jail for what they say. And so I think that one great move was, I mean, there was this terrible thing where it was literally illegal for people of the same sex to enjoy coitus together. That strikes me as an unacceptable position from a classically liberal point of view, for the same reason that it's just not the business of violent state actors to get involved with what you say, with what you do when you're not harming others. Just keep out, back off. And it's extremely concerning to think that speech is now being policed in the way that homosexuality was once being policed. It's just, it seems like bad ideas just come in new costumes, but they don't really go away unless we put in a bit of effort. And I hope that the Finns do put in that effort.
Very much agreed. All right, that's all the time we have for today. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please like this video, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Please like this podcast, share it with the wide world if you thought it was worth listening to. Thank you very much, and we will see you soon on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.